Well, welcome everyone. Tonight we have a special treat. Our own Phillip Hoose, graduate of Speedway High School, and one of the few Hoosiers
Spark
won the
plug.
national book, Claudette Colvin, Twice Towards Justice. It is a book that won also a Newbery Honor book, and he's written inspirational books for young people for several years. His book, Hey Little Ant, that he wrote as a song with his daughter Hannah, has been translated into 10 languages, is an adorable picture book, and is also an inspirational book for children, and shows Phil's loves for nature. He worked at a nature conservancy in Maine for many years and has written beautiful books about nature and the natural world. His book, Hoosiers, is considered the history on Indiana basketball. He's going to talk about growing up in Speedway and a wonderful, charming book called Perfect Once Removed. But first, we're going to hear about Attucks. So, Phil.
Okay, thank you very much. Darcy, thanks a lot. We'll start with a song. Hail our spark plugs, hats off to thee. To our colors, true we will ever be. Brown, gold, white, united we stand. Working, ever failing, never pulling for our teams together. Spark plugs, we think you're G-R-A-N-D, 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 grand, grand, grand. My daughters used to go outside on the way to school and they'd look back at me and say, smash 'em, bust 'em, Dad. Well, I can't thank you enough for showing up. I can't thank the library enough for thinking of me, booking me. It's been a wonderful return so far. I've been in the company of Tom Smith almost all the time, and he's taken me to school after school, the Lions Club, and I've just had a blast. It's been a lot of fun. And then later on in the weekend, as many of you know, there will be a dedication of Meadowood Park's basketball scene, a plaque that's put up. And that's special too, because I played a lot over there. I live in Maine. I've written 13 books. I graduated from Speedway High School in 1965. Didn't have a clue what I was going to do. Went ahead anyway. Went to IU, and it wasn't the greatest experience I ever had. Got married, which I probably shouldn't have done, to a dancer from what was that summer stock theater Starlight Musical. She was in the resident kind of chorus line for Starlight Beautiful. And then one day her dad sat us down and said, you have to get going with your life. This is not a good pace. So he said, you can make your own option up, or else I have an option for you, which is I know a friend who has a billboard company in Spokane, Washington, and you could paint billboards, Phil, for that. So I had a talk with my wife, my bride, that night, and we decided to go to New York City instead. So we did, and I had a great time there. Didn't do anything in particular, but I had a great time. Latched on an office temp job with the Natural Resources Defense Council, an environmental law firm that was just sort of getting started. This was in the early 70s, 71. And then I kind of parlayed that into a job with the Sierra Club, and then I talked myself, or wiggled my way into Yale. A graduate school at the School of Forestry. I got out of there and started a job as a biologist type for 37 years for the Nature Conservancy, which was just a great job to have. I kept writing. I'd been encouraged by one teacher in particular, Grace Hine, who many of you know or know of. I just never quit writing. I wrote magazine articles for Sports Illustrated and the New York Times Magazine and the Boston Globe Magazine. And then one day it was suggested that I do, sort of something else, that I wasn't helping this one. So anyway, I went to Yale and stayed there for a couple of years. And then got this job and kept writing, got an assignment at one point from Sports Illustrated to go to Indiana and find out why basketball is so important in Indiana. They gave me $3,000 and a letterhead saying you can show this to anyone you want and say that you're working for Sports Illustrated, which I did. And I got to interview Bobby Knight, Larry Bird, and all sorts of people, but the one I wanted to interview the most was Oscar Robertson. And he said yes, and we sat down for 3 hours in his lawyer's office in Cincinnati. He was a huge guy. He sat at the other end of a lawyer's, long table, chewed unlit stogies some of the time. There were African game animals poking out of the walls in a dark paneled room. I mean, it was really something. He set up everything. He was the big O, and I was just another pigeon, and he was just going to break me down, But we got along, and we talked a lot about Crispus Attucks High School. Something I had always wondered about when I lived in Indiana is why, 6 miles would separate our front door at Speedway from Attucks' front door, and it would be 2 different universes. That there for a time, as you all know, all the African-American high school students in Indianapolis had to go to Crispus Attucks High, and we, of course, in Speedway, had our own situation. I remember going to school with one African-American girl who moved in 8th grade, and that was really it. And I just always wondered about it. So anyway, as I was talking to Oscar, he said, the Klan really made a mistake when they organized Crispus Attucks High School. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, and also it was the thing that really integrated the schools of Indianapolis was the fear after we at Attucks, Oscar said, had won the state championship, that there would be a dynasty and nobody could ever beat them, and they had inadvertently crowded every black athlete in Indianapolis into one school, and there was a great fear that there'd be a dynasty, that they'd win every year, and so they started breaking it up, kids went to Tech, Shortridge, Washington later on, and so forth. But I said, what about the Klan? And he said, I don't know much about the Klan. I just have always heard that the Klan started our school. So anyway, I started interviewing more people over the years. Whenever I'd come home for a reunion or something, I'd make several interviews. And finally, after 30 years of trying, I stitched together a book, and I'll present the book tonight, and then we'll sing some more. That's Oscar Robertson, the big O, a dominant player. He was part of a great migration. His family was, between 1916 and 1970, 6 million African Americans emptied the South and moved to northern cities, looking for jobs in factories, looking for better school opportunities for their kids, just looking for a little bit of respect, not having to deal with those signs anymore. They went many scenes like this, many scenes on the bus, many scenes on trains. And when they came to Indianapolis, they were shocked because it was basically the same story in a northern city. There was one neighborhood which everyone called Frog Hollow. It was a low-lying area on the near west side of Indianapolis where everyone was shoehorned in, all the black people in the town just about, in the 40s and 50s. And it was a discouraging place to live. It was unheated. They had outhouses as bathrooms and so forth. And they were not allowed to do many things. There wasn't the signage in Indianapolis that there was in some of the southern cities, but the impact of social policies were just the same. Riverside Amusement Park had 2 roller coasters, Flash and Thriller, and blacks could go ride on those features 1 day a year, but only if they turned in 60 Polk milk bottle caps. And sometimes they called it Negro Frolic Day. And when I interviewed African Americans from that era, this was something that always came up. That was so deeply resented. in this state, as I'm sure many of you know, this state was for some reason susceptible to the Ku Klux Klan, and there was no state that had a bigger per capita membership in the Ku Klux Klan than Indiana. The person who orchestrated all of this was this guy right here. His name was D.C. Stevenson. He was a master salesman, a demagogue, and he could get people to do what they wanted. And he got him. He played on the fears that people had. For example, my grandfather there on the right, he hated Catholics because he was afraid that he was a coal miner, and he was afraid that Eastern European Catholics were going to come in and take his job away from him. And I heard, so many bad things at my grandfather's dinner table. My Aunt Ellen was a chameleon. That was sort of the ladies' auxiliary of the Klan, and she was very active in it. I saw one piece of paper, a deed to some property that she owned that had a codicil in it that said it could not be transferred to a black, a Catholic, or a Jew. I mean, this state was just stained by the Klan in those years. And he once said, D.C. Stevenson, "I am the law in Indiana," and he was. In 1924, the gubernatorial race, a fellow named Ed Jackson, the Republican candidate, won election by winning 90 out of 92 counties here in Indiana. And he did all his campaigning in the back of D.C. Stevenson's Cadillac. So that's how it was. And when 1924 election came in, it swept in a lot of change. School boards, judges, county board members, public officials were put into place too. In Indianapolis in 1922, the school board voted by a vote of 4-0 to vote a school, to build a school for all blacks in Indianapolis. And no, that's not them. They finally finished it, and the first students in Indianapolis Crispus Attucks opened their doors and began studying on September 12th, 1927. On the day that the school opened, parades of Klansmen in their hoods and robes marched in front of the school to, just to try to get them off to a good start, to be intimidated. This is a scene from the front of the school in those days, of Crispus Attucks High School. And it wasn't entirely a sad story in that they assembled a tremendous faculty at Crispus Attucks High, in part because there was such an availability of teachers. They'd come out of all these black colleges and there'd be almost no jobs for them. And so the administrators could get the cream of the crop. So they had there were 2 teachers at Crispus Attucks High School in those years that could speak 7 languages. They had just tremendous discipline and pride, and it was a good place to go to school, even though it was a kind of a foul purpose getting them there. This turns into a basketball story, as so many Indiana stories turn. The first thing that the administrators of the Crispus Attucks High School wanted to do when the school was open was go down and apply for membership in the Indiana High School Athletic Association. If you were a member, then you could play in the Indiana State Tournament. So 3 African-American leaders went to Anderson to meet with Arthur Trester, who was the king of the Indiana High School Athletic Association. They pled their case that this would mean a lot to our morale and our spirit. It would show that we're all together in the city, one city. And he put them down. He denied them. And the reason that he gave was because Crispus Attucks was not a public school. Only black people could go to it. So how about that? And he did give one little tiny concession. He said that Attucks could play against one team at a time, but not in a tournament. They couldn't participate in a tournament. So that left them with they'd go to these little schools, tiny little schools, Pine Village, and this one here is from Smithville, and you'll see number 17 there, Crispus Attuck. They have it misspelled, and I wanted to read you a little something that. This was an interview from a cheerleader, an elderly lady who was an Attucks cheerleader in the days when they could only play these tiny little schools. And she said, rural children clustered around the Attucks players as they emerged from the vehicles when the buses would pull out to these tiny little schools, gawking at the first dark-skinned people many of them had ever seen. Some shyly asked for autographs. It was like we were from outer space, recalled one Attucks student. I would hear them say, look at that one, he's really black. According to a former cheerleader, quote, everywhere we went, folks would wait for our buses to arrive and then follow us into the gym. I remember one night this little boy came down and wanted to talk to the cheerleaders. He was a friendly little lad, and we had a good chat. He stayed right with us through the start of the game, and a few minutes into the contest, I felt this scratching at my arm. I turned and looked, but I didn't see anything. A little later, there it was again. That little boy was scratching my arm with his fingernail and then putting it into his mouth. It isn't chocolate, I told him. It's my skin. It's the same as yours. I'm just darker than you are. And that's the kind of thing they had to go through. One of the people who wanted to get a job in teaching was Ray Crow. He was his family was one of two families that were in African-American families in Johnson County. He was the first son in a family of 11 kids, and he was a great athlete. He became a triple sport star at Whiteland High School, and then went on to Indiana Central and became an even greater star. In fact, he told me one time that he was at a track meet against Hanover College, and that he outscored the Hanover team by himself. His coach in high school took him to what was then called Butler Fieldhouse to watch the big tournament games, and he decided he wanted to coach, but nobody would give him a break, because he was black. And then he got a job at a junior high next door to Crispus Attucks High, and he began to see the talent that was around the playground. They didn't know how to play basketball because they had come from the South, and they just hadn't played there. They were on farms and so forth, did farm work. But this is Lockfield Gardens, which is kind of the Meadowood of that neighborhood on the near west side. And there were some terrific players. Ray Crow in 1951 was offered the Attucks job. And in 1942, before that, Arthur Trester was finally backed down, and he had to collapse and cave in his stance and allow African-American and Catholic schools and the School for the Deaf to play in the tournament. So the first few years between 1942 and 1950, Attucks played in the tournament, but they never did very well. I think twice they got into the second game of the sectionals, but that's the best they had ever done. So for whatever reason, Ray Crow was picked to lead Attucks, and there he is with some of his stars, Bailey Robertson, Hallie Bryant, and he, after school, would have practices and would teach them how to play the game, how to play rough, but how to play with skill and strategy as well. And basketball was undergoing sort of a stylistic revolution. As you'll recall, some of you anyway, at the beginning, they would shoot free throws underhanded and, two hands on set shots and bounce passes and so forth. Well, Ray had something different in mind. He realized after practicing that Attucks had 6 players that could dunk. And he made sort of a dunking show out of warm-ups, and he put all 6 in a row and they just jammed the ball. And it got to the point where the opposing coach would not let their team come out of the locker room until Attucks had done this, 1951 was the first year that they really thought they had something at Crispus Attucks, and the town really got behind them. This is from the Indianapolis Recorder, which is an African-American weekly here, still is in Indianapolis. But this is all the business people subscribing and saying, "Go Attucks." Everyone was just on fire. And they got to the regional final against Anderson. And Anderson was one of the monster, huge schools in Indiana, still is. But they played in a place called the Wigwam, which seated 9,300 people. You know, Attucks didn't have a gym of their own. It was just, every game was an away game for them, and they tried like crazy to build their schedule, but still, even though Arthur Trester would let them play, there were a lot of athletic directors who would not play their team against Crispus Attucks. But what they're talking about here is a victory against Anderson. Attucks beat them in the regional final on a shot with 4 seconds left. And people said it was the best game anyone had ever seen around Indianapolis. The guy who hit the shot, the game-winning shot with 4 seconds left, was Bailey Robertson. And there he is. He was a great shooter. Not much interested in defense, everyone says, but everyone says that about everyone. So yeah, he hit that shot, and it was the biggest shot in the history of his school. He was one of 3 brothers who came to Indianapolis in 1942 with their mother. On the right is Henry Robertson. Up in the top is Bailey Robertson, who everybody called Flap because of the way his follow-through was when he shot. He'd hook it like this, so everyone called him Flap. And down in the lower left is Oscar Robertson, who ended up changing everything. They not only had no court of their own, but they never saw African American referees, and so there were some really big problems there. They ended up, Ray Crow saying, "Get off to a fast start. The first 10 points are for the referees. The rest of the points are for us. But you've got to get a lead, or even a close. If you get yourself in a close game, you'll not win." I just threw in this slide because I think it's a remarkable slide. This shows how big basketball is here. This is the Indianapolis Star, and there you see in identical font sizes one of the 3 or 4 most significant episodes in the Cold War. The Rosenberg spies were executed, and then right below it, in the same size, Hallie Bryant threatened. He took a phone call, and someone said, "I'm going to kill you," and so that made it equal to the Rosenbergs. I don't know. Ray Crow was really disappointed. He thought after the 1951 tournament, which they did not win, they went on after Anderson and they got to the Final Four and they got killed in the Final Four, the semifinal game. And then the next season, he felt he was robbed by referees, and then the next season something happened, the next season something happened. He was starting to get discouraged when people started telling him about this kid who lived in town. He was Bailey Robertson's brother, Oscar. And in 1952, they had the first junior high tournament for the public schools of Indianapolis. And Ray Crow went out to see Oscar play. He got in the final game. And he told me a story. He said at the end of every quarter, Oscar would dribble the ball, looking up at the clock until enough time had lapsed down, then he would freeze or paralyze his defender with a series of fakes, and then go up and lay the ball in. And then he did that all 4 quarters. And Ray Crow said he had never seen such contempt, and had never seen a player like that. He said, this is going to be something, when Oscar gets old enough. This is Oscar, the 8th grader, a polite kid. He was well liked. He was shy. He was smart. Ended up being in the top 10 in his class. He, between his sophomore and junior year, went down to work on his grandfather's farm in Tennessee, as he always did. But this time he came back looking like this. He had gained nearly 6 inches in height and about 30 pounds in girth and muscle. And the people who pushed him around at Lockfield couldn't push him around anymore. They just weren't strong enough. He was the only person, Oscar was, who owned his own basketball in that neighborhood. his mother worked as a maid, and when Christmas time happened, the lady who owned the house said, "Is there anything your kids would want?" And Oscar's mother said, "Yeah, basketball." And so this woman gave Oscar's mom the second string ball for his son. It was cut up and gouged and everything, but it was a basketball. And Oscar pulled it out of a gift box on Christmas, and everyone was jealous of him. He made it very clear it was his ball, nobody else's. And he used it in the neighborhood as a weapon. You know, they weren't gonna play, you know, with his ball without him in the game. And that was one of the advantages. The guy was just nuts about basketball. There was a tournament they had at Lockfield, and Lockfield Gardens, then they would close down around 11 o'clock at night. Oscar would get out and shoot at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. His mother didn't discipline him in that way. She said, "Well, at least I knew where he was." And there were all these complaints from the head of Lockfield, and so he would Bruiser Gaines was his name, was take a gun, a shotgun, and shoot pebbles against the backboard, and Oscar would go home. You know, that was the way it was. In 1955, at last, the African American community felt that they had a great team, an undefeatable team, and this is that team. They were done with the old schools, the little bitty schools, the Smithvilles of the world. Now they had a schedule that was just packed, stem to stern, with big Indiana teams, and they traveled. They were they were a great attraction. Everybody wanted to see them play. And so on some nights, they'd get over 10,000 fans at Butler Fieldhouse. This would be on a Wednesday night for a non-tournament game, and these were by far the biggest crowds that had ever been seen in high school basketball in the United States, just in the middle of the week. And they got rich, Attucks did. Lon Watford, their athletic director, opened an Attucks fund. They had thousands and thousands of dollars, and they bought beautiful outfits with capes, and they traveled in Cena cruisers to games, and it was just really something. And the best it ever got was in those big games at Butler Fieldhouse when Oscar played. And look at the crowds. I mean, I remember those crowds, but just barely. But man, I love that picture. This is Oscar on defense, just a man among boys. And at last, kids had heroes of their own in the neighborhood. They didn't have to go to professional players or try to watch IU on television or anything like that. There's Oscar on the right, and Willie Merriweather, who was also just a great player, with him. And these are clearly starstruck kids. And some commentators observed a trend, a shift happening in basketball, with most of the starters now being African Americans. They plowed through the tournament in 1955, and they got to the Final Four, and then they got to the final game, which they played against another all African American team, Gary Roosevelt. And it was quite an anticipated game. Everybody watched it, you know, from their home. The city did an interesting thing. They volunteered to send cheerleaders from the other schools in the city to the game to cheer with Attucks' cheerleaders. And Attucks cheering squad welcomed this. And you can see them from Howe and Tech. And the one over here on my far right, his name is Bob Waite. He was a cheerleader from Broad Ripple, and he became a TV star in New York. He did commercials mainly, but I came to know him pretty well. The game was exciting, and they won. Attucks won. Attucks didn't win. They just slaughtered. Gary Roosevelt. I think it was 93-57 or something. No one had ever done that well. What they wanted was a parade. See, it says their parade is out, and they did indeed get to board. This is the cover of my book. I love this photo too. There's Ray Crow in a conga line, and Oscar, who was he probably wouldn't have any problems getting a date after. But they got on a fire truck at Butler Fieldhouse, and they went downtown, and many had assumed that they would stop downtown and people could come rush the fire trucks and congratulate them, or they could even get off the trucks and mingle with people. But that isn't what the city had in mind. Just a few weeks before the final game, the mayor, Alex Clark, sent a delegation, the police chief, the fire department chief, the commissioner of education, to Attucks, and there was a meeting held, and basically it was Herman Sibler, the education commissioner, said, it looks like your players are going to win. Attucks is going to win this tournament. And Lane said, yeah, we think so. And he said, well, we're going to have to make some rules because we don't want there to be a riot. We don't want the town to be torn up. And Lane was deeply offended by that, and he said there will be no incident such instant. But what the city, who never did trust this outcome, did, instead of letting them out or letting them mingle, they kept going. They went around the circle, and they went out to Northwestern Park, which was in the African American neighborhood, and had a huge bonfire. Oscar spent the night getting more and more bitter, and after a very short stay there, he went home to his father's house, used his key, got in, made a sandwich, and fell down, on his stomach in front of the television set. And when his dad said, "What's wrong?" he said, "They don't want us, Dad." And it really was very hurtful sort of thing. Whites had a chance to consider their own racial views for the first time en masse that night. There were a lot of people in front of the television set who wondered which was worth more, that Attucks had ended a 44-year spell of no Indianapolis team having ever won the state tournament, or did it mean more that it was a black group of kids who did it? And people came to their own conclusions. We have a classmate, Helen Bledsoe, from the Speedway class of '65, who told me that her dad got real excited because an Indianapolis school had won, and got his hat, jerked off his coat, and said, let's go downtown and join the parade. Well, they went downtown to join the parade, but the parade wasn't there. The parade was at Northwestern Park, so they got in line and they crawled, to Northwestern Park and went through the parade, went around there. And Helen said that that episode and just her admiration for Oscar Robertson changed her and made her more determined to do sort of social service things. She ran a clinic, I think, downtown. But everybody had everybody who had a television set and was inside their room kind of had to make their own decisions about this. Before long, the expansion of the hospital and the Interstate 65 demolished their neighborhoods. Those who owned property, and they were very few, were offered $200 and given, I think, about 6 weeks to move out. And there have been a lot of speculation about whether Attucks' basketball team and their great champions really changed anything or not in the city. I mean, the consensus seems to be that it was a little easier. You didn't have to sit in the balcony all the time at the theater. You could go to blocks and airs. But here is the thing that Oscar wanted me to understand. The success of Attucks' basketball integrated the high schools of Indianapolis, said sports writer Bob Collins flatly. They became so dominant that the other schools had to get black basketball players or forget about it. They went from not caring to crying, illegal, unfair. They were even saying, this is illegal. They were saying, Oscar lives in the Shortridge district, and Hallie Bryant should be going to Tech. In 1951, I don't think any other team in Marion County had a black player. By 1955, Shortridge had 4 black starters. By 1956, as black families continued to expand into Indianapolis neighborhoods, Tech High had 769 black students, and Shortridge had 657. As Collins put it, integration was just making a slow start, and Attucks basketball success speeded it up. Many whites came to believe that Attucks' success changed the way blacks and whites came to view one another. Attucks forward Stanford Patton said, "I don't think it had ever happened before that the whole city got behind one team. That showed me something. I knew they didn't really have to like us, but they had to respect us for what we did and how we did it. We destroyed a lot of myths that a black man couldn't outcoach a white man, and that we would break under pressure, that we were cowards. That was the perception that people were introduced to. That's what even some of us blacks had believed." Attucks was almost closed. It was almost turned into a junior high, and then it almost closed. But it was saved by a different format. It became a medical magnet school where people went if they wanted a career in medicines like forensics specialties or even being a veterinarian. It continued its high quality academically, and several years ago they restored the basketball team, which had been closed down. And the tournament, as you know, split into classes. They're in Class 2A, and they won the state championship in 2017. And this is the guy taking, and he won, sinking the final shot, that Attucks player. And when it was over, Oscar came out to put a medal on around all their necks. Oscar never has quite forgiven Indianapolis, I know that, and although Indianapolis has tried to hug Oscar, he's sometimes hard to hug back. The closest, I think that he ever felt to just feeling a little bit better about it was this downtown parade that involved surviving Attucks players from those years and also cheerleaders. And after all those years of interviewing people and coming home and so forth, I wrote this book, which was published last year about this time, Attucks, Oscar Robertson, and the basketball team that awakened the city. I just like to say, that it was quite a journey for me, still is, to learn about all this. It was not just a basketball story, it was a story that involved my family, my community, and it was sort of an honor to be able to do it. And I'll stop there. And thank you for.
Christmas Attucks was certainly an underdog. And there was another underdog that started school in 4th grade in Fisher Elementary.
Oh, me?
Yes, very young. And it was, you learned to love Speedway not through auto racing, but through baseball.
Yeah, that helped. It really helped. So, you want me to?
Jump in with your story of baseball.
I tried to play baseball in Speedway, but I moved from South Bend. We hadn't played there at recess. I didn't know the game. And I was hurting because back then, believe it or not, that was the key to success. Like at recess, that was what you played. And I found out of desperation, my mother just remarked one day that I was related to Don Larson, this Yankee pitcher, that I actually had blood in the major leagues. And I wrote him right away. I was a bookworm. I was a real nerd. Our car would be piled with books as I, tried to learn about this or that through informal reading. And I wrote to him, started writing to Don Larson, and he didn't write back much, but he sent me stuff. He sent me a ball autographed by all the 1956 Yankee teams with Mantle here and Berra there. It was great. I still have it at home. He sent me a glove with a cobalt blue Spalding lettering on it. He sent me his hat, his third string hat, but it was a hat, had a bent bill, and I wore it out. And I tried to learn that sport. A lot of people helped me. Mr. Harley was the one who helped the most, and Doug DeWitt's and Joyce DeWitt's father, Paul, was a really good coach. He was my coach for a couple of years. I tried. I topped out as a 13-year-old like pony leaguer, I think, and Tom Smith's dad was my coach. My heart throbbed to pitch. I wanted to pitch like my cousin, and O.P. Smith wouldn't let me do it until like the last day, the last day. And I had a curve, I'd been working on script, so I went out there and did okay. I probably pitched 1 or 2 innings, but I did okay. And Tom's dad drove me home. He was in a truck, as I remember it. And he looked at me and gave me the ultimate compliment. He said, "I should have used you more." All right, so, any questions, comments, lawsuits?
How did Oscar Robertson respond to your book?
Well, we're negotiating now. Me and the big O are man to man to make a movie of it. Well, hold your applause. So many slips between the cup and the lip in this game that.
That's already overachieved.
Yeah, that's how I look at it. Yes.
Did Oscar ever describe how he went about thinking where to go to college? Did he ever relay any of his college?
Yes, he did. He was all set to go to Indiana. That's what he wanted. And he and Ray Crow drove down to Bloomington. And Branch McCracken, the Indiana coach at the time, kept him waiting, cooling his heels outside the office. And finally, he opened the door and beckoned them to come in. They came in, and he said right away, he said, "I hope you're not the kind of kid who expects money here." And Oscar he is easily offended. Who wouldn't be offended by that? And he basically walked out of the meeting, and that was it for that. There were all sorts of dumb people, though, as far as getting him. He went up to Purdue. He didn't like it. He said he felt lonely. He went to Michigan, and they didn't meet him at the airport. How could you be so dumb? But he finally chose Cincinnati because it had a co-op program where you could work and be an athlete and a student at the same time, and he liked that. So that's my understanding of the story. Mark.
Phil, I just want to say, obviously, we had a long time basketball connection, but the human side of this is really fascinating. I didn't understand. I hadn't read the book, and it's marvelous. Which you get into those things. I admire you for that. That's tremendous, and that's why if it makes a movie, it'll be a success.
Thank you.
Well, they may have helped pave the way for integration, but I remember the sit-ins at the Woolworths downtown. What was that, early 60s? That was after the 55 war.
Yeah, I'm not claiming, and I don't think he was claiming that did it,
No, but,
But it contributed. I mean, it was a small pebble that started things. I don't think any doubt about that.
It was a biggish pebble.
Yeah.
where did they go to school before they created a high school?
They were sprinkled throughout the feeder schools in the neighborhoods. Here's your chance. I mean, you can get to know me as you never have before.
Hey Phil, what year was it what was it, one of the state finals manual with the Golden Boy and Armstrong twins versus Attucks?
It was Kokomo that they played in 61. Yeah, Goose Ligon. And Kokomo beat them by a point, I think. It was a really close game. That was when I tried to learn to smoke.
Why was that?
My parents went away, and I thought it was time, So I lit up and just about reversed my lungs.
What year was that?
61.
61, wow.
Yeah.
You tried breaking into that tobacco at an earlier age than most of us. It must have been about 12 or something.
Well, anything else? Yes.
Talk about your work at National Conservancy. What did you do?
There are people who'd love to be in this room.
Your bosses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the Nature Conservancy, for whom I toiled 37 years, seeks to protect animals and ecosystems by protecting the lands and waters that, that they need. It's hard to, but there were these programs that the Nature Conservancy spawned. They were called State Natural Heritage Inventories, and they were inventories of all the plants and animals in a state. They were state by state and province by province and territory by territory in Canada. And we funded them, and we incorporated all the literature on where species and natural plant communities of concern were, computerized it all, and then made printouts to guide conservationists. Hey, we only have 2 of these protected here. Let's get them. There are 5 over here. We'll let them alone. I mean, this really reduces things. But the whole point was to help conservationists, both public servants and private organizations, to protect habitat in an intelligent, disciplined way, in a pattern. So my job was to kind of sell these programs to government officials in the Canadian provinces and in the West for a while. I did some other stuff. I bought land for them. I raised money for them. That was what I did. Yes?
How did you end up, or your parents making the decision to live in Speedway?
My dad had kind of promised my mom that we'd live in California. That was the big dream. And we went out to California. We took that California trip that Chuck Berry's always talking about, And he applied for jobs and didn't get hired. They told him that he needed more education in certain areas, and I don't know what they are. I didn't even know what he did. And so he came back and applied at Bendix, and he couldn't get a job there, but he applied at Allison, and apparently he had some skill set that they needed, and that's why we live in Speedway. Yes?
Don't be shy. Tell us about your songwriting interests and career.
Well, I started playing blues harmonica when I was in graduate school, and that's what I really studied. I just loved it. And then I learned to play guitar from my first wife, and I just started writing songs. Tonight I missed Miller Time again. What if the Russians don't come? One of them, I'll do this. One of them got turned into a children's illustrated picture book and has sold over 1 million copies and is in 10 languages. It's called Hey Little Ant. It's a dialogue between an ant about to get squished and a kid about to squish it. Can I sing it for you?
Sure, please.
All right. So when I'm sitting down, I'm the ant. And if I can work my knees when I'm standing up, I'm the kid with the raised up shoe. Hey little ant, down in the crack, can you hear me? Can you talk back? See my shoe? Can you see that? Well, now it's gonna squish you flat. Please, oh please, do not squish me. Change your mind and let me be. I'm on my way home with a crumb of pie. Please don't hurt me, don't make me die. Anyone knows an ant can't feel. You're so tiny you don't look real. I'm so big and you're so small. I don't think it'll hurt at all. Yeah, well, you're a giant, and giants can't know how it feels to be an ant. Come down close. I think you'll see that you are very much like me. Are you crazy? Me like you? I have a home and a family too. You're just a speck that runs around. No one will care if my foot comes down. Oh, big friend, you are so wrong. My nestmates need me 'cause I am strong. I dig our nest, feed baby ants too. I must not die beneath your shoe. My mother says that ants are rude. They carry off our picnic food. They steal our chips and our breadcrumbs too. It's good if I squish a crook like you. Are you crazy? Me? Oh, I'm not a crook, kid. Read my lips. Sometimes ants need crumbs and chips. Why, one single chip feeds our whole town. You must not let your foot come down. But all my friends squish ants each day. Squishing ants is just a game we play. They're looking at me. They're listening too. They all say I should swish you. Well, I can see you're big and strong. Decide for yourself what's right and wrong. If you were me and I were you, what would you want me to do? Should the ant get squished? Should the ant go free? It's up to the kid, not up to me. So we'll leave the kid with the raised up shoe. What do you think that kid should do? So my daughter and I wrote this together, Hannah, and we sang in a family band. We had a family band, and we got a big gig in Portland, New Year's Eve gig, and Hannah and I sang that song for the first time. And when it was done, all these kids, started raising their hands. This had never happened before. Nobody had ever raised their hand, And I just said yes to one of them. And the kid said, "What if it's a fire ant?" And somebody else said, "What if you spilled a glob of honey on your kitchen counter and there are 500 ants coming? Don't you have to do something?" And you could see all the adults So yeah, I've written a bunch of songs and sing them. I'm in a band now called Chipped Enamel. And, Americana, that's what we do. I love music.
How old was Hannah when you guys did that?
9.
Oh, it's a great memory.
She was 9 and her little sister was 2, and it was a sticky August day out in our driveway. And Ruby, my younger daughter, who was the 2-year-old, was out there going, and I was on the porch with Hannah watching this. I couldn't take it anymore, And I went to her and I said, "What are you doing?" She goes, "Squishing ants." I said, "Why?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, how would you like to be one of those ants?" And she said, "I wouldn't care." And so I started thinking about it. What if the ant had a voice? And so I asked Hannah if she'd like to write a song, because we've been writing songs together. And she came in, we got a yellow legal pad, put it on the kitchen table, and took about an hour to write it. And I think this has been mentioned. It sold over 1 million copies. Most of them were like these Scholastic book fair, so they're cheap newsprint sort of things, but several 100,000 were sold in glossy hardcover. It's been a great thing.
Well, it's a great message, as are some of the other things that you've written.
Thank you.
I think they're a national treasure.
What do I get? Well, okay, if there are no more questions or comments, I would be glad to sign anybody's book or anything, but I can't thank you enough for coming.
Phil is one of those nonfiction writers that could make any book sound like a fiction story. I knew Christmas Attucks was going to win, but I was on the edge of my seat rooting for him through the whole book. So do read Phil. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer.
Could I say just one more thing? I spoke a little bit earlier about Mrs. Hine, Grace Hine, who was my English teacher who encouraged me a lot. And I stayed in touch with her after I got out of school. And when I'd come home, I'd visit with her. And when Hoosiers came out, it was the first book I had that ever sold anything. It sold like about 30,000 copies. And Kroger Foods made a deal that for a month, I think it was, they would provide space by the cashier and put my book in there, you know. So one night I was living in New York, and the phone rang, and it's Grace Hine. So excited, you know. Phil, you'll never guess what happened. You know, what happened? I said, I was at Kroger's. I got to the cashier, and there was your book. And I picked it out of the rack, and I showed it to the cashier. This is my student. This is my student. And she said, you know, that cashier didn't even seem to care. All right, I'll end there. Thanks again. Thank you.